Thanks for having me, Mike. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, so for you, I know that you run Ohio X along with many other folks, but maybe tell me a little bit more about you and kind of your professional journey.
Sure. So I grew up in Northeast Ohio, the Akron area. My family moved there when I was really little. My dad was in the rubber chemical industry, and Akron has historically been the rubber capital of the world. So that's what brought us to Ohio from out of state. I grew up in the Akron area. I was a couple years behind LeBron James, so he's probably the more famous Akron resident. But that was a lot of fun being, kind of growing up as he did too, and seeing it go from this kid you hear about who was really good at basketball that would be in like the Akron Beacon Journal, and then slowly, ninth grade, 10th grade, all of a sudden ESPN's coming to town to catch him and his games on television. And so, I grew up in around that time, so that was a lot of fun growing up. And then I went to school at Miami University down in Southwest Ohio, which is about 4 hours away from my parents' home. At the time, Oxford is a great college town. Miami is an incredible school. That's where I met most of my best friends, and it really shaped my life and my professional career. So I can't think of a better college experience that I would have had. And through that, ended up, I've always been a kind of a government policy nerd. And so got involved in that world, and ended up spending a lot of time out in DC for internships. And that's where I graduated and went out to Washington and started my career out there.
Nice. Well, so you went to college right down the road from where I went. I went to University of Cincinnati, so
Yep.
right down the road.
Yeah. Although you were in a city, and we were, as like to say, we went to college in the middle of a cornfield.
Right.
For those that haven't been to Oxford, it's a very, very, very small town, and it's like when you think of college, it's like the quintessential college town where there's one street uptown. That's where a few of the restaurants were. We didn't even have like a Chipotle at the time or anything like that. So it was you went there for college and nothing else, but that was part of the fun.
Right. And it is a great school. They've got a great program to go overseas. I actually ran into some of your potential comrades when I was in Munich, maybe, I don't know, 15 years ago. Just randomly just ran into a bunch of Miami U students at the Hofbrauhaus, of all places.
Yeah, yeah. Miami's we don't have like a law school. We don't have a medical school. It is very much an undergraduate focused institution. And it's, as you said, yeah, the study abroad programs are incredible. The internship programs that because we don't really have the luxury of doing internships with companies in big cities like a lot of students do. And you may have at Cincinnati, because I did one semester, and that was a 45-minute drive each way from Oxford down to Cincinnati. And that's kind of tough for a college kid, especially if
Right.
you don't have access to a car or something, which many don't for at least the first or second year on campus. And so they have in a very good way, a very strong focus with connecting students and opportunities to travel, to do internships in cities like Washington or New York or San Francisco, whether you're into government, whether you're into technology companies. And so I'm a big fan of the school. It was a great place to go to school, and like I said, a lot of my best friends still to this day, that's where they came from.
Nice. So you'd mentioned, from there you went to DC. You're a policy nerd, and now you're in the public sector. And so you've created this thing called Ohio X. What is that?
Yeah, so Ohio X, we're a statewide technology and innovation partnership. So we're a nonprofit-based organization, member-based, where companies can join. And the mission is to unite and promote Ohio's technology and innovation communities. In every industry, there are groups like ours that represent companies and those interests, and try to promote them, to showcase what's happening and why Ohio technology companies are doing incredible work. And so You can look at manufacturing, you can look at hospitals, you can look at farm and agriculture, you can look at, there's literally, I live in Columbus, and if you draw a 4-mile radius around the capital, there's literally something for everyone. That even the Poultry Association exists. And so a group of folks, myself included, got together, and we weren't like, hey, let's start an organization. But we were just talking about some of the challenges and opportunities of being in Ohio. Ohio's a very unique state. We're very geographically diverse. A lot of states, especially around our size, might have one large city and then everything else kind of filters up to it. So if you think of you take Columbus, Cincinnati, Cleveland, combine those populations, make it one city, that'd be like Chicago and Illinois, or in Atlanta, Georgia. But
right.
Ohio has really strong regions, and that's a quality. If people that have been here, live here, grew up here, visit here, you can find literally everything in this state. There's truly 4 seasons. We have a Great Lake. We have farming and agriculture. We have the hills of southeastern Ohio and mountains of southeastern Ohio, river towns. There's literally something for every kind of geographic, interest or area. But that also, I think, makes it in some ways challenging because, people know what's happening in their respective city. But I think historically, a lot of folks have, say you're in Cleveland, you know what's happening, but you don't necessarily know or see what's happening in other places like Cincinnati. And so I think sometimes people will just kind of bypass connecting with others. And so we looked around the country and saw that there were groups like what Ohio X is now, and thought it would be a really interesting thing to try to bring to the Buckeye State, with the idea that we could better connect, better unite, better promote the technology industry, because we're also not a state that has large population growth that's flocking to us. We're not North Carolina, we're not Arizona or Colorado. And for Ohio, I think, to have success, it's going to be because of technology. How do companies innovate? And that can be a unicorn startup, which there's a couple that exist in Columbus, or that could just be a traditional business, and a place like Northeast Ohio that maybe makes things. But how do they leverage technology? How do they innovate in order to stay competitive? And so we're an organization that is hopefully helping add to that.
Nice. Yeah. And, I love your comments around just the diversity of the state. And, I grew up in Cincinnati, and it was the strangest thing. Anything north of Columbus didn't really exist for Cincinnatians. And now I live in Northeast Ohio, and everything south of Columbus doesn't exist. And so you're absolutely right. It's, we do have these kind of niche cities that are really good at certain things, and we really capitalize on that. But as far as bringing it all together, that's been tough. At least culturally, it's been tough. And hopefully through organizations like Ohio X, it makes it easier to connect these communities in a more meaningful way.
Yeah, and you make a good point. And I know you live in Northeast Ohio now, grew up in Cincinnati, and so I've had that perspective too. That's 4.5 hour drive between those two metro areas. And that's, for 4.5 hours, you can fly anywhere in the United States. You can be at any city. And so I think that's where, in some ways, it hasn't, it's not the easiest thing to connect, or to figure out what's happening, or to create opportunities, partnerships, sales, hire, whatever it is. And that's where, increasingly in this digital world, which we've all now been completely forced to because of coronavirus, there's an opportunity there. And I think that helps everyone, because if you take, what is Ohio good at? And you look at healthcare. We have, starting in Cleveland, you have Cleveland Clinic, University Hospitals, Metro Health. You go down to Columbus, you have Ohio State, Ohio Health. You go down to Cincinnati, you have Cincinnati Children's, University of Cincinnati. And you can do that same thing with manufacturing. You can do it with financial services, insurance. I would put what
Especially
Ohio has.
Yeah.
I would put what Ohio has up against anywhere in the country. It might be a little more dense with places like Boston or San Francisco or even Chicago, but the amount of research, the amount of business that happens here is really incredible. And so Ohio has this tremendous bedrock, which has existed for a very long time, that it makes it such an incredible place to live and work and do business. And I'm not, there's been a lot of smart people before me that have said this, but the Midwest is this incredible opportunity, which, again, oftentimes gets overlooked. Simply, people consider us flyover country. But if I think we can help, promote that, spread the word, increase awareness, and also just better connect, there's quite a lot of bit of incredible stuff that I think that can happen here.
Oh yeah, totally. I couldn't agree with you more. And I guess for a lot of the listeners of this podcast are just from all over the place. And it's funny. I spent a lot of my career on the West Coast, and whenever I had said I'm from Ohio, the first thing they think of is farms and barns and everything in between. So I guess, for Ohio X, what are some of these, maybe moonshot types of goals do you have for the organization?
Yeah. So, and I'll kind of share what we do. And I kind of like to break it up into like 3 areas or 3 buckets, and some of this overlaps, and we certainly do more. But the first area we're trying to focus on, and we just started. So it's only been a few months, and we launched right before the holidays and right before a global pandemic. So we have incredible timing with launching this. But the first area is, we think, increasing awareness, because so often, and this is really how Ohio X was started, is I and others that were kind of in the early stages of putting this together, even before it was an idea, would be talking to people, talking to someone in Cleveland, and then talking to someone in Columbus in the same conversation. And it, oftentimes, the first kind of aha moment was always, I never knew that existed, or I didn't know that was going on, or I just had no idea. So we think increasing awareness is such an important thing, because there's already so much incredible work happening. But a lot of times, again, it goes back to kind of how we're a very distributed state. It's sometimes difficult to understand. And that's a couple of reasons. One, there's just a natural, if you're in Cleveland and someone's in a different, 3 or 4 hours away, you're just not going to know about that, because that's just not where your network is. But if we're looking at it from a state perspective, how can we increase that? So in some ways, we want Ohio X to be a media organization, where, as we like to say, we can tell the stories of the people, companies, and ideas that are building Ohio's future. And because, in Cincinnati, for instance, there's a giant Amazon air hub that opened up at the Cincinnati airport. Just so happens it's actually in Kentucky, but that doesn't mean anything. But if
it looks
they're
like
doing
something to roll into that deal, Cincinnati gets the name, right, but they get the airport traffic.
Right, exactly, yeah. And so, we think that through storytelling, being like a bit of a media organization, where we're communicating with people directly, and we've had a ton of success with that early on through newsletters, podcasts, op-ed opportunities, original kind of reporting that we're trying to build into. That hopefully that will solve it, because whether someone's trying to raise money for a venture, someone's trying to find a startup to do a joint partnership with it, if you're at a big co, or vice versa, awareness is such a challenge. And so that's kind of that first area. The second is events, programming, and education. So a lot of organizations like ours will have their conferences, will have their events. So we'll do those, and we've already in some ways been disrupted because of coronavirus, because we've had a few things that were going to get canceled. One event we were working on, we were really excited about, was bringing startups with big co's and people from big co ventures together, because there's I think 54 Fortune 1000 companies in Ohio, and there's an incredible amount of startups, and we think there's an entire sea of opportunity where there hasn't been a lot of collaboration historically between those two groups. So that's like an example of like an event. On the education side, I mentioned 54 Fortune 1000 companies, but a lot of Ohioans, I think most of them, don't work at big corporations. They work at middle market businesses. They work at manufacturing companies. If you're in the western part of the state, it might be agriculture or farming, which is maybe one of the biggest, if not the biggest, industries in our state. And so how can those businesses that aren't hiring MBAs out of Ohio State or Case Western or recent college grads from Miami or Cincinnati, how can they understand, adopt, and leverage technology? So they're not disrupted by it, but they're using it to their advantage. Because I grew up in Northeast Ohio. The last recession, when that hit, that was very difficult on the region. And so how do Ohio's businesses, how do our business communities become more technologically kind of focused and have opportunities? And there's never going to be that, wave of, again, recent college grads or MBAs into some of those businesses, because that just doesn't make sense for a lot of reasons. But if those like CEOs or C-suites at those companies that employ 50 to 500 people can connect with the technology experts that our state has so much of, we think there's a tremendous upside to making a lot of businesses, a lot of industries more competitive through tech as opposed to being disrupted. So that's kind of like that second bucket. And then the third and final bucket is advocacy. So again, going back to, there's literally a group and organization in our state for every industry to advocate on behalf of, in front of policymakers, government officials, to just kind of make sure that the voice is heard. That hasn't historically existed for the technology community, which I think for a lot of reasons. One is technology is historically across so many different sectors, and you don't have to be a tech company per se, but you can be a big co that just has a strong tech focus. But also just younger. A lot of startups are smaller. They don't have the advantages of being around for, decades, where if you're in traditional kind of sectors or industries, they've been cultivating relationships, figuring out how government interacts with the public sector for literally years. And we're seeing it now with everything with coronaviruses, businesses getting shut down, industries disrupted. And it's those ones that already have relationships and understand how government works that are able to make sure that their voices are heard and their perspectives are taken account as laws, rules, and regulations in the midst of all this, which is so confusing to everyone. And a lot of companies have, armies of accountants and attorneys and lobbyists, but the tech community, especially if you're a smaller tech company, it just hasn't existed. And so there's an opportunity, I think, there for us, which we're really excited about.
Yes, that's really fascinating. And it sounds like, this organization with those three major pillars, it's really going to provide a lot into the region, hopefully bring talent from outside Ohio. So not just, cultivating what we have, but also, bringing talent into the state as well. And, when we think about crisis, I know a lot of the coronavirus, COVID-19 bits, originated in China. And then what's interesting, the example that I'll give is the actual word for crisis in Chinese is probably completely bastardizing this, is Weiji. And it's actually two words. And what was fascinating about this, and I think I talked about this on another podcast, is, and probably many others are probably talking about it because it's probably a cliche now, but at any rate, it means both danger and opportunity. And outside of that kind of catchy definition, if we look back to, let's say, Y2K timeframe, what came out of that? We had companies like Google emerge out of that crisis. The 2008 financial crisis, we had a number of companies like, Airbnb, Uber, and many others come out of that crisis. And so hopefully what we'll see here in this crisis, more of that same opportunity for areas like Ohio. And, this podcast, we talk a lot about, how to innovate, what are innovators thinking, best practices. And I guess for you, from an Ohio X perspective, as an Ohioan, what do you think are the major draws for innovators to come to Ohio?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say the easy one that's very cliche, but we're seeing it in real time now, is cost of living and just quality of life. And I'll say that's cliche, but it's also true, because
it's
I
totally
know,
true.
Yeah, and I know, and you've lived and experienced all sorts of parts of the country, and so have I. And we're seeing it with, I was with a friend 2 nights ago, who lives in a major city in the East Coast. Him and his wife left because of Corona, because they wanted to get out of their high-rise apartment building. and are staying at their in-laws' place in a suburb of Columbus. And we were sitting there in the backyard patio, like 8 feet apart. And he was saying like, "Hey, would you ever like want to live here?" I was like, "Well, I kind of do," but he kind of gets people thinking. I'll say though it's true, but it's also not the only answer for Ohio, because there are a million places that you can live where it's cheaper, where your quality of living is increased, especially if you get outside of a San Francisco where you might have 10 roommates and you pay like $3,000 a month to share a bedroom or something like that. So It's not just a matter of Ohio competing against San Francisco or New York and recruiting people to come here. Then we're up against the Denvers or the Kansas Cities or the Indianapolises. So like, why would someone come to Ohio as opposed to any of those other places that don't border the Pacific or Atlantic Oceans? And I'll probably butcher this statistic, but I think it's something like 40 or close to 50% of younger Silicon Valley tech workers were looking to leave the Bay Area in the next 12 months. And this was a study well before coronavirus existed or any of us knew what that was. And so I think there was already a bit of a movement, but now we've seen it sped up because people are actually able to realize it, whether they're staying with parents or kind of renting places. But that means—
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. What I predict out of this whole crisis is that it's going to be an accelerant for folks to realize, hey, I don't necessarily have to be in San Francisco, LA, Seattle, Austin. I don't have to necessarily be in these geographies, because we've already tested this whole remote work thing and it's working out just fine for us. I have a friend that, lived in San Francisco downtown, had a loft, the whole, living the dream. And, he moved to Vegas, and, he's got 4 times the square footage and half the price of what he's paying for a loft. He's got a house in Las Vegas with a swimming pool, plenty of room for his family. And so when you think about geographies like Ohio, I've started to realize, and I moved back here maybe 5 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, is that if you've got a family, being in this type of geography with the great school systems, all the things to do as a family, like you said, you've got 4 seasons. That's both a blessing and a curse,
given especially where you live,
our reliability. Right. Got that darn lake effect. But having those 4 seasons is something that I actually missed when I left, not as an adult, but for my kids, for them to experience fall and all the traditions that go with fall and winter and all that great stuff.
Yeah, and that's where I think a lot of kids, you kind of take you don't really appreciate where you grow up and kind of the life you have until you actually have to start paying bills and like figuring it out for yourself. And so I went away to school and I hadn't spent more than, I don't know, a week, outside of a Christmas holiday or something like that at my parents' house where I grew up. I haven't done that since I was like 18. But I'd always thought I wanted to move to the East Coast, live in DC, and I would kind of build my career and stay there. But it didn't take very long for me to realize like I kind of miss all the things that I had access to, or just the quality of living back in Ohio. And so it was kind of a quick flip of the switch that 22-year-old me would never have believed. But now that I'm in my 30s, it's like you really understand it and appreciate it, because there's just so much that goes into life, let alone getting into like family considerations and all that, and just being closer to folks. But so that's where I think that like right now is such, it's for us, it's how does Ohio recruit people up against these other places like Pittsburgh or Detroit or wherever else, because that's where the real question is. And yeah, Corona's completely sped that up. And that's where for a lot of places, it's we live in Ohio, it's college football state. And that's the lifeblood of any college football program is recruiting. I remember Nick Saban, when he got hired as the Alabama head football coach, he was on like his private jet flying from Miami to Tuscaloosa. And he asked the ADs, like, do you think you hired a really good football coach? And the guy was like, yeah, I hope so. And he's like, you hired a good recruiter. And that's what it's about. Because if you have talent, everything else is going to follow. And it starts with talent and people. And that's where it's an opportunity. And that's, I think, the challenge for any place.
So speaking of talented people, in your mind, because there's lots going on right now in Ohio, what are some of the more notable innovative projects, initiatives that are going on right now here in the state?
Yeah, so in Columbus, where I'm at, and I'll kind of, I guess, do a tour of the state and give everywhere kudos because we are a statewide organization. In Columbus, we have a pretty great startup scene. Cover My Meds was our first unicorn, and then there was an exit there. So they for over $1 billion. Root Insurance, they're another unicorn startup now, which I think their last raise and valuation was $3 or $4 billion. And there's a handful of others of really, and so like Cover My Meds, it's kind of like a back end health tech. Root Insurance is InsurTech. There's a bunch of other kind of AI, healthcare, InsurTech startups that are burgeoning. And I think that's an example of like, what is Ohio good at? And you see these businesses that are sprouting up. The next Instagram may not come out of Ohio, but we're seeing, especially in Columbus, this really strong tech scene that's been growing that is kind of built around what we're good at. So in Columbus, that's incredible. And then the flagship of Columbus and Ohio is Ohio State. So their medicine and their research and tech, you can put up against anyone in the world. And a couple of years ago, I had a kind of an outpatient procedure at the Ohio State Medical Center. And as I was checking in, they're like, where did you come to us from today? Thinking I flew in or something like that.
Right.
And I was like, I could have walked here. And they're like, oh, that's kind of odd, but I think that's like the testament of what we have in our backyard. If you go down to Cincinnati, the University of Cincinnati and Cincinnati Children's Hospital recently announced that I hope I don't get this wrong, but the Cincinnati Innovation District. And there's a big investment from the state of Ohio and Jobs Ohio, which is kind of our jobs creator entity in the state. And it's going to be this really incredible, because again, it's research, tech, healthcare. And so they're building this giant infrastructure down in Cincinnati, which is going to be, again, I think the vision is that you could put it up against any innovation district in the world. And you think of what like Pittsburgh's done with Carnegie Mellon and some of their stuff, and Google and driving cars. And so I think in Cincinnati, you're going to see something like that because of what already exists, and then the leadership that it takes to build something and dump the capital into it. And so Cincinnati, it's an exciting time down there, and then up in Cleveland.
So before we leave Cincy and Columbus,
sure.
One thing I think is really cool that I didn't realize this till maybe a year ago was that Columbus won the grant from the Paul Allen Institute for smart cities. Mm-hmm. And they're creating the national playbook for how to build a smart city. Yeah. How cool is that?
Yeah, it's really incredible, and it's been fun to see it. And I don't have a role in the day-to-day of that, so I've just seen it as a taxpayer and a constituent like a lot of other people. But it's really great. And yeah, it was a competitive bidding process, and our Columbus was, because of good work, got it, but very fortunate to get it. And I think Columbus is so interesting because we're an exploding population-wise city that there are, a lot of places don't see the growth that we're having, especially when you're in the Midwest. And I was looking at like a top 25 city growth list that, USA Today or someone put out. And I think like everything was down in the South or West. The closest may have been like Louisville, Kentucky or something like that. And so for Columbus, there's so much good work being poured into how do we grow smartly, because we've seen like what happens with Nashville or Austin, that a lot of places they kind of turn into these like concrete jungles because they just the infrastructure can't keep up. And I know you've spent a lot of time in Austin, and I was there a year ago, and I was with a friend who works at Uber, which has a pretty big Austin presence, or at least when I was there they did. And he was like pointing to me the skyline and all the stuff that was popping up that didn't exist 5 years ago when he first moved there. And so I think that's the challenge. But through things like Smart Columbus and smart cities and the planning that's going on, it's intelligent and smart growth so that we don't lose the tremendous lifestyle that we have. And you can, any big city with a lot of population is going to have, traffic and congestion, but you don't want to kind of be one of these cities that has been overrun with people. And that's, brings a lot of new challenges that can be tough to fix.
And, that's another draw. I mean, I lived in Austin, Texas for a number of years. And this was during that period where there was a lot of people from California, moving to Austin. Apple created, I don't know, there's like 2 or 3 new buildings there where, they shifted all the, not the MacBook Pro, but the tower, the Mac Pro, where they essentially are manufacturing that in Austin, Texas. And then along with all these startups with Uber and others, and the city infrastructure just couldn't keep up. And it was an absolute nightmare to get anywhere in the city. I mean, you would have to carve out, what would normally be a 20-minute drive now is an hour and a half drive. And, that becomes taxing and people don't want to do that. It was the same thing when I lived in Seattle. I lived maybe if comparing it in Ohio terms, 15 minutes from the main campus at Microsoft. And it took me an hour and 25, 30 minutes to get to work every day. And so if you've got a family, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And so I think that is another big draw that I've seen here, at least in Ohio. Now, I'm not one to talk because I work out of my house. So my commute every morning is from the second floor down to my basement office. But outside that, but yeah, I think that's a big differentiator. But also we've got, really smart politicians as well. So, I've been working with Congressman Davidson out of the 8th District on quite a bit of blockchain oriented bits. Yep. So he's pushing bills for, digital currency, trying to get better formation of how to deal with crypto and all those aspects. So there's definitely some interesting things from a public sector policy perspective as well. Yeah,
and that's where for Ohio, and it doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat or libertarian or a vegetarian. We're kind of lucky to have a lot of really smart, dedicated folks that get that. And I think we're Ohio again, which a lot of us love, but typically you have to come here to understand it. And we're not that, we don't look at Ohio and put a pen on the map and it's like, I'm going to move there at some point. Once you're here, you kind of get it, and it becomes a much easier recruiting sell. But yeah, at the state of Ohio, there's Innovate Ohio, which is happening. That's been an effort launched by Governor Mike DeWine and Lieutenant Governor John Husted, and Lieutenant Governor Husted heads it up to make Ohio a more innovative state. One of the early things they did was for the BMV, if you have to renew your license, something as simple as like making an app where you could schedule it and not have to go spend 4 hours on a Saturday waiting, pull your ticket, wait in line. And I think it's a lot of these little things, which I've spent a lot of my career working in government on technology projects, and they're big lifts. But with strong leadership, it's possible. And that goes back to the city of Columbus, which, has a Democrat leadership. And they went out and bid and got Smart Columbus. And so we're seeing it kind of at the state level, at city levels. And that's, that's growth. And we're also, again, leadership, it doesn't matter which side of the aisle you're on. And Governor DeWine and our leaders here during Corona have been kind of cited as this national model. And I don't think it's by accident that they're one of the ones that have really stepped up, and Bill Gates and others have acknowledged the leadership that's happening. And we've seen it previously, and now others are kind of taking notice. And, you look at who elects these people, and it's Ohioans. And I think that's because, we're kind of, I don't know, there's a lot of good people here. So I like to think that they're related, that good people elect good people.
Yeah. One thing that people will definitely notice about Ohioans is we're probably some of the most polite people on the planet.
Right.
There's so many pleases and thank yous and good mornings and how you doings and all that great stuff. Of all the places that I've lived and visited, I've gotten more comments about my politeness, my Midwestern politeness, than
Right.
anything else. I was in a
Right.
coffee shop in Seattle, and this barista was like, "Oh my God, you're the nicest person I've ever met," and I'm like confused. I'm like, "Wait a second, we haven't really been talking."
Right. You're like, I said thank you, made eye contact. Like,
Yeah, I said thank you for my coffee, and have a
right.
great day.
Right. Right.
But it's those little things, and I think you're definitely right that at the end of the day, as things go more and more digital, as we innovate more and more, we're going to appreciate these other qualities much more. It's very similar to the not necessarily analogy, but the behaviors and the trends right now that's happening. So if you take, let's say, music, you can download endless, millions and millions of songs on a very, very small device. Great. So why now are people going and buying records?
Right.
Right. Now it's because humans are analog living in a digital world. That's the reality, right? Until we upload ourselves, we're still analog. And so, having those experiences of a record and having a collection and the textile feeling of it and hearing the crackling in the music and the quality of that music is something, people are gravitating towards. Likewise with books, my personal prediction is that we're going to see people with libraries again, because now I can put everything on my Kindle or my iPad or whatever it may be. But I still want the experience. I want to be able to smell that book, right? I want to be able to go and have a shelf full of hardbound, beautiful books that I can show people. I think those sorts of things are going to come back. The more and more we innovate, we're going to maximize experiences for the things that we really do appreciate. And, that's where, coming from this area and people gravitating here, we definitely respect those aspects quite a bit.
Yeah, and I'm with you because I firsthand I'll do like an Audible or something like that to listen to it, but I prefer the books, and I'm the same thing where I like kind of collecting those, and I like having them and looking at it. You pass it on your bookshelf, and I remember reading that, and I don't know, I like kind of going back. I'm a history nerd, so the perspective and kind of being reminded as I pass something about Winston Churchill in that book. It's like, that's a good guy to study these days.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we talked about Columbus, all the cool things happening there. We talked about Cincinnati, and then you've got Cleveland, and we've got an explosion of we mentioned blockchain, a lot of blockchain work happening there. What other cool things are happening in Cleveland?
Yeah, and I think it goes back to kind of what is Ohio good at, and healthcare leads the way. Cleveland Clinic, which is internationally one of, if not the top hospital healthcare system. University Hospitals, another leader. They have an incredible ventures team that's doing all sorts of innovative stuff. And then you have like Metro Health, which is another big one. Manufacturing, and I think that's something with Corona, and we're seeing now that the struggles of, we used to make and build things in America, and Ohio is like, that's like ground zero of places that used to really manufacture, especially Northeast Ohio. And so I think that's like again, I'm not the first person to predict this, but I think we're going to see more onshoring. And hopefully that's an opportunity for places like Ohio and businesses, whether you're the people actually building them or you're a startup that wants to help, artificial intelligence or automation or robotics to help these manufacturing businesses, produce more, make more, be better, higher margins. And so, we build things in Northeast Ohio. It's healthcare. There's a bunch of kind of insurance and financial services. And so there's and research too. You have Case Western, you have the University of Akron, which is a leading polymer research kind of higher education. And so I think Northeast Ohio there's such a strong manufacturing history that hopefully one of the I think there's a lot of positives that will come out of Corona, but one of the big ones is I think we're hopefully going to start making more things in America again for a lot of reasons. One, because going back to kind of books and those like want really better things, and then it's also just safer. We don't have to worry about the Pacific Ocean and crossing borders, and we can employ people here because there's a rich and proud history of people that make things, and that's something that's a real positive and a real proud, real sticking point that people here are really proud of.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, and I think a lot of this comes down to how we do it. And we've got really great leadership. We think about things very progressively. My work at Microsoft, my work at Gartner, I've had the opportunity to be able to go around the globe and see innovation, at its source, talk to, innovation labs and VCs and all this great stuff. And, one thing that I've observed is that there is innovation that can happen that is trying to reinvent a situation that's going nowhere. Or you can innovate around something where you're creating net new markets. And so, what I hope for Ohio is that we understand that, we're not going to get rid of the global economy. We're not going to get rid of the resources that some of these other countries have that we just don't have for a lot of different reasons. But that doesn't mean we can't do a lot here and a great deal of it. And so I think that's something that we need to be careful of, is not letting that pendulum swing too far one way, but also understanding where these technologies are going and how we can embrace those to create this leapfrogging effect. So let's say we do bring all the factories back to the States, other countries are going to do similar things, and they're not going to fill them with people. They're going to fill them with robotics, right? And so for us to be competitive, we need to be the world's leader in innovation. I mean, that's, I talked to some congressmen maybe a year ago, and I said, hey, we used to be the world's innovators. We were the leaders. I mean, we created the internet. We created transportation as we know it today, with the highway system. We invented, telecommunications, all this stuff. And now, we're falling behind a bit. And so, how do we get that resurgence back? And so, from an Ohio perspective, yes, we're great at medicine. So how can we use these emerging technologies in really, really cool and interesting ways and invent that and sell that tech to other countries that are going to want to do the same thing, that are going to want to have, autonomous robots in their factories? Because I can tell you right now, so the company, I don't have there's my prop, my iPhone. Foxconn replaced 60,000 people with reinforcement-based learning robots. Why? Because, for obvious reasons, because we live in a capitalistic society and, we're driven by that. But did they displace all the workers? Not necessarily. They up-leveled them and moved them to more productive tasks. And so I think that we have a real opportunity as well to not only take what we're good at with these established industries, but take these industries to the next level and maybe even create new industries.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Ohio is very well positioned. And I think even like, as you're talking about the innovation and creators, I mean, a lot of the early astronauts were from Ohio. We have this really proud tradition. I think the National Inventors Hall of Fame's even in like North Canton or something like that, maybe Akron. And we have this really proud tradition. And I think once we kind of look at, all these things that we have the researchers, we have the higher education kind of research institutes, medical centers that do this. Everyone wants to be like that next Silicon Valley. But how do we become the first like innovation valley where we're able to take all of this and kind of piece it together? And hopefully Ohio X can play a small role and a piece of the puzzle to it. And as you mentioned, things that we're good at and leveling up those industries. Well, in Northeast Ohio, we used to make all these cars. Youngstown used to have this really, really, GM factories and really proud tradition. that have
Yeah, GM was in my
changed.
hometown. I actually
Yeah,
watched the GM factory shut down in the late 80s.
yeah,
Yeah.
and it's horrible because people lose their jobs. But then you look at like what Tesla's doing, and you'll see these like tweets from Elon of like, oh, where should we put this next factory or this or that? But like, when you talk about, we're producing the engineers in colleges, we have the workers that know how to make these cars. Why can't that? And again, I'm not the first person. I'm sure there's a ton of stuff behind the scenes to get Tesla to build their next, car factory in Northeast Ohio or wherever. But it's those types of things. And you mentioned, medicine. How do we export that? As I talk to hospital systems and kind of their tech commercialization folks, it's like two things that they're like, hey, this is where we need help is one, money and capital. And that's nothing new that no one doesn't know. And I think it's 95 or 98% go to 3 states and we get the rest. But you have, Drive Capital in Columbus, which was a big VC firm that put a big thesis and experiment on Columbus in the Midwest. And that's proving their point. But, these research institutions, they need the money. And that'll come once you have the ideas. It's just hopefully that pipeline's accelerated with Corona as operators start to leave. But they also need the entrepreneurs because they have the PhDs, they have the scientists that know that side of it, but they don't have the business operators that know how to take that, that technology, partner with that scientist or that doctor or the PhD, and build it into a business and spend it out. And so those are kind of the two things I keep hearing. And hopefully, as this exodus, someone's looking. It's like, why would they come to Ohio? Cost of living, you can get that anywhere. But plant your flag, buy a house right by a Case Western or by Ohio State or Cincinnati, because they have the research happening. They just need people that can help and partner, and that's where I think there's a tremendous opportunity. And that's one of those things where we can level up and take what we're already doing and just kind of take it to the next level.
So when you look at what you want to mold Ohio X into, what other states, cities, countries inspire you?
Yeah, there's quite a lot. And that was something shocking that, again, we didn't come up with hey, let's build an Ohio X. It was literally just like talking. It's like, there's got to be some type of solution out there. And then we kind of opened our eyes and realized that a lot of states across the country have groups and organizations like ours. It's like, well, why doesn't Ohio? If it works in, I won't say states, but if it works in other places that you wouldn't think it works, how do we make it work here? Utah has a really incredible organization that I've followed from afar for some time now called Silicon Slopes. I think they had their recent kind of Utah Tech Summit, which was, I think, beyond Utah. I think they had like 20-ish thousand people that went to Salt Lake City for this, and Mark Zuckerberg was the keynote. We talk about just, attracting people, and once they experience a place and they have a connection and maybe they visit, and maybe they decide to open up a Facebook office in Salt Lake City because the CEO had a great experience and saw all these incredible people. They're a pretty incredible one. Georgia has a really strong one. Arizona, North Carolina, Oregon, even some regions and cities have stuff. And so that again, that was what was pretty shocking, is that more places than not. And so there's definitely the blueprint for the success. It's just a matter of us, can enough people buy into the vision that we're preaching, and do we have time? And hopefully Corona doesn't, put a stop to it too much. But luckily, thus far, it hasn't. So we're still pretty bullish on the future.
Yeah, as much as COVID has knocked some of the wind out of our sails, I think that it's not going to stop innovation. We're still going to keep innovating, and I guess so. I mean, there's so many places to draw the inspiration. Are there specific programs that get you excited? So, like for me, I see programs like Project NYC, where New York City is trying to not only create a digital first city, but also what they're trying to do is they're trying to do ambitious things like you see in France, where they're trying to essentially reduce the cars on the road. So they're converting streets into pedestrian walkways. And what they've actually found in France is that it actually improves traffic. for a lot of different reasons. So what's interesting is that project for me is interesting because it's taking the best of technology, but it's also looking at how we as people interact, optimizing that interaction, and how do we start to change the way we work in shared spaces and all that to optimize these cities and make them greener, reduce the pollution and get after some of these big macro issues from a global perspective. That's really exciting. Are there similar programs and projects that excite you from other states?
Yeah, from other states, I would say there's been a couple around talent, and because again, I think as we were talking about earlier, everyone's trying to recruit talent. Unless you're again
Right.
Silicon Valley or maybe a Boston or New York, talent's going to be a challenge. And so there's a couple out there that have had interesting one for people within their state or their city, meaning like college students or upskilling, maybe people that don't have the most technical background but want to learn stuff. And then the other one is that we're really interested in is boomerangs. So people like us that grew up here, left for whatever reason. And I'm of the personal mindset that there is nothing wrong with leaving because you get new experiences, you try new things,
Yeah.
you learn, you create contacts. And I would not trade my time away from Ohio and traveling for anything because it led to who I am. But I also think
Chris, I think that's a phenomenal point, though. I think, and I want to double click on that because I think that's what helps us innovate within the state is if we go and experience how other places are dealing with these issues and how they've solved those issues, we can apply the best of those learnings back to our own state. So I think, doing a bit of a tour of duty, whether it be, I don't even encourage it outside of our country and
right.
seeing, how other countries are dealing with very similar issues, but also, one of the things that I realized, just being a global traveler, also appreciating the stuff that we have, going to a third world country and seeing roads fall apart where you're like, oh yeah, I used to complain about potholes everywhere, but this is nothing compared to, 3 lanes of traffic that's made into 5, and there's goats and sheep, on the side of the highway, and people walking in between these cars that are inches from each other, just crazy stuff. And it makes you just appreciate the things that you have, but also look at things in a slightly different way.
Right. And I think that's those are great reminders that in a lot of ways we won the lottery ticket because we were born here. Like there was nothing that said I had to be born where I was born when I was born. And that is
Right.
such an advantage that I think is easy in day-to-day lives to overlook. And for us, for me personally, it's this, once people go and get those experiences and build those networks, which are a tremendous asset, how can we get them back? Because a lot of people, again, as we've talked about, being in Seattle or Atlanta or some of these places, it just becomes the living lifestyle is just difficult. Or, hey, I want to buy a house, and for $1 million in San Francisco, I can buy a 1-bedroom, but in Ohio, I can have a mansion. And so it's like
Right.
time to have that family. And so I think there's so much work that can be done on that kind of, I don't want to call it problem, but just that reality, because also the longer you're away, the tougher it is to come back because your network isn't in this state. Your connections aren't here. There's only so many jobs that as you advance in your career that actually interest you. And so, what can we collectively, but then specifically Ohio X, do to help bring those people back that have spent 5, 10, 15 years in other cities, whether it's out of the United States or on the coast or wherever else, and help them land here, whether that's start a business, whether that's join the existing business community, because it's those, I think, that's an area that I've seen anecdotally, certainly in Columbus, I think is probably a little more prevalent than in other parts of the state, where we're seeing that. And people are like, this is incredible. This is an opportunity. But I think there's still a lot of work to be done. So that's an area that really excites me of how we can help with that recruitment, help with those connections, introduce people back to the Ohio ecosystem so that they either have soft landings or so that they just can figure out the opportunities that exist as opposed to, if you have an accomplished career at an Amazon or a Facebook or a Google, you probably don't want to go on Indeed.com and like put your resume in with everyone else. You'll probably get a call back, but it just, it's just not the best way to probably go about it for people that are really accomplished but want to return home.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So, we've talked a lot about Ohio and the innovation in Ohio. But, let's talk a little bit about the elephant in the room,
Okay.
which is we got this global pandemic that has descended upon us. So I guess my next question to you is how has, from an Ohio X perspective, how have you guys thought about the pandemic? Are there any things that you guys are doing differently or sponsoring different programs to help out with the pandemic?
In a lot of ways, it hasn't changed anything at all. And in some ways, I think almost proves the thesis, because as a statewide organization, again, we don't have that one major metro area where we are never going to be that group that's like, let's get together for a coffee event series every Monday morning. And this is what we do. And that's how we provide value, by the physical in-person networking connections. And I think a lot of organizations have historically relied on that. And that's just kind of how they've been built. So in some ways, I think it's, as you mentioned earlier, good businesses, good things are built in difficult times. So in some ways, while it'd be easier if this wasn't all going on, certainly, I kind of like the idea that we're having to prove the idea when it can't get any more difficult, not what. And so it forces us to like prove the thesis as when it's tough.
Yes, and so what's funny, you kind of spurred something for me. I was on a virtual happy hour, which I've been on a lot more of these than I care to admit. So one comment that was made on this local Cleveland kind of virtual happy hour was, hey, when all this is over, I kind of like this format. I kind of prefer this more in a lot of ways than, getting in my car, driving someplace I've never been, going to a place where they only maybe serve a certain type of drink. In this case, she likes wine. She doesn't like beer. So she's like, I've got my favorite wine already here. It's mailed to me on my doorstep. I'm comfortable. I'm getting the information I need. I'm sharing information that I want out in the universe. And this is working for me. So I think, there's also going to be this kind of balance back to like what you were saying around, establishing this community. You kind of established it at the right time to essentially get people to join these virtual communities, because now it's like, well, I kind of have to.
Right. And I mean, even for like you to go to a happy hour physically in Cleveland, based on where you live, that could literally be an hour each way. So by the time it's an hour drive each way, and that goes for a lot of people, and that's not even accounting for like traffic, if this is rush hour. So an actual in-person happy hour works really well if you work in a densely populated, downtown scene. But for the most part, like, it can be really tough. And so that virtual happy hour just puts you in the same room with someone else who probably would never meet at a physical happy hour. And so I agree with you. I think there's a lot of things born out of this that'll stick, and hopefully so. I'm also a believer that, the internet has increased opportunities in general, not Ohio X specific, but for everyone, that you don't have to have gatekeepers. It's easier than ever to put your ideas out for the world to see. You can build a community online. The marketplace, unless you're a restaurant or something like that, is literally however many people currently exist in the world. And so that's where I kind of like that what we're doing is already so digitally based and so virtually based, because for me, I mean, before all this, the pandemic hit and everything shut down, I was in, 5 or 6 cities for like 4 days. And I got home on Friday night and I was exhausted. And I hadn't done anything all week other than meet with people and sit in my car and drive, which is fine. And there's, the human component, going back to kind of books and records, that'll exist, certainly. And we're all, personally, I can't wait to like hang out with people in person again. But like, there's always that mix and that balance, right? And that's where I think like proving theses, building ideas in difficult times, whether it's companies or just how people connect, is it's yeah, it'll be interesting how we come out of it.
Well, one thing's for sure, when we come out of this, at least for me personally, I will have come out of this pandemic with more home projects completed, more yard work, and all sorts of stuff checked off the honey-do list. So that will be one of the positive things that comes out of this. But in all seriousness, there's like we talked about, there's innovation happening everywhere. And I have perhaps a benefit behind this question, because I'm on a COVID-19 task force for Microsoft, where we're evaluating solutions and all that stuff. But some of the things that have surprised me is just companies that are in completely different industries are now making surgical face masks. They're engineering drugs. They're doing all sorts of things that are outside their industry. And some of the innovations that have really in some ways surprised me, but were somewhat obvious. Just the notion of being able to certify that someone is disease-free, COVID-free, by linking something as trivial as, hey, linking your doctor a test to a person, which isn't really easy. It hasn't happened yet. And so I think, some of the best innovations that I've seen come out of this are some of these innovations that were like, we should have probably done this like 10, 15 years ago, right? What are some of the things that you see, innovations that you're excited about that are perhaps based here in Ohio?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been really interested to see, as you mentioned, companies that are shifting to making the personal protective equipment. And I know a number of companies that there's one up in the Cleveland area called Maker Gear that they make and build 3D printers for schools, for businesses, and they quickly switched to making equipment that they could get out to hospitals. So from a COVID perspective, it's been really, I don't want to say fun, but it's been really rewarding to see how that traditional business community has responded so quickly and shifted right away. I mean, here in Columbus, Battelle, which is a incredible research-based organization, they were the ones that came up with the decontaminating the face masks. Essentially, it puts into it kind of takes like a almost like the back end of a semi truck that kind of the whatever you load all the goods into, drop it off at a warehouse or something. But it was I think a doctor. It was a husband and wife, doctor and researcher. One worked at the hospital, one worked at this research organization called Battelle. And I think one night they were just talking and they're like, oh, I wish we could just like, instead of having to buy all these masks, can we just clean them and then be able to reuse them and increase the life from, one wear to 20 wears before you have to toss it. And so that made actually national, probably even international news, because I think like the FDA originally, Battelle said like, we can do 100 decontamination or 100,000 decontaminations. I'm just throwing the numbers out there. And the FDA said, oh, you can do 20,000 in a week or whatever. And our governor and others were like, what are you talking about? The tech works and it's been proven. And like why would you cut out 80,000 decontaminations? And I think like President Trump even got involved, and it was a whole thing, but then they got it okay. So It's been incredible to see organizations like that, especially on the healthcare, because again, I've said it a million times, but we have so much quality institutions and systems. And so, whether it's Ohio State or Battelle or university hospitals, there's been so much leadership from a healthcare perspective that's been really, really, really cool to say. And then I would say on a personal perspective, I'm talking more with friends and family using video component than I ever have. And I'm doing it with people that don't even live, that, me hanging out with them in person isn't even an option in normal times. But
Right.
because of this, I've been talking and communicating with people more that, maybe I would text occasionally. And so I hope that sticks around, because I have friends, and most of my good college friends live in different cities: Nashville, DC, Portland, Cincinnati, all over the country. I have friends in Singapore that I've been on video chat with multiple times during all of this. And I never did that before, but like, why didn't I? And so I really
Right.
hope that sticks, because that's been fun and rewarding to have like those virtual happy hours with people in other cities that we just never thought to do. But now it's like normal and what people do, and that's been fun and refreshing, and amidst all this craziness, real positive for me.
Yeah, no, I agree. And, I've noticed the same with both family and friends. I'm never really video chatted with my parents, and
Right.
now we're video chatting. So yeah, I think it definitely is making us realize the importance of that human connection. So, at some point we're going to come out of this. There's going to be a
Mhm.
light at the end of the tunnel. And, some say, and I'm not a scientist or a doctor, but, the rumor is, here in the warmer months, we're going to get some relief, right? We're going to be able to do things that are semi-normal. But what all the medical professionals, the scientists, even the pharmaceutical industry is saying is that, we're not out of the woods yet, right? And so the proverbial shit has hit the fan once, and we weren't prepared for that. We got completely, totally, caught off guard. Now we may have another kind of turn of the crank once the southern hemisphere, goes into the colder season, and then we kind of see this cycle happen again. I guess, one of the things that I think about quite a bit, and, I'm working with my clients on as well, is how do we prepare for not if, but when the next big pandemic comes? From an Ohio perspective, how do you think, Ohio, I mean, obviously we were really good at responding
Mhm.
and, provide a lot of really great leadership and made some really hard decisions, and surprisingly a very quick turnaround time, which, major kudos to our leadership there. But from an Ohio X perspective, from an innovation perspective, what do you think we could be doing more of to prepare for that next wave? Whether it's things that are already in flight or things that you think that we should consider going into this?
Meaning like the next wave of COVID, or like the next whatever COVID 25 is down the line.
Yeah, I mean, it could be, and a lot of people are saying that, the fall and the October timeframe, we're going
Gotcha.
to get hit, and we're going to be
Yeah.
back down on lockdown.
Yeah.
So, what do you think some of the innovations, either that are currently being invested in, or maybe we should invest in? What do you think, Chris?
Yeah. So I would say that I'm of the, and I'm no doctor or scientist. I'm not smart enough to be one, but so I won't try to play one. But I I'm of the mindset that, I think what's so striking to this, and I think a lot of people expect one day to like, oh, we're reopened and back to normal, and people compare coronavirus to a war. Well, on Victory Europe Day or Victory Japan Day, there was a hard stop and people went out in the streets and you celebrated, and all of a sudden that flip was literally just switched right away. I think for me, the most striking is we aren't going to have that ticker tape parade saying we beat coronavirus, because that's literally the last thing that should happen is a bunch of people get together. And so I'm very much of the mindset that this is a very gradual reopening. What kind of concerns me is how, we have a 50 state strategy to how this is happening. And I know like Georgia, for instance, is one that's like, oh, we're going to reopen. And so I worry about the uptick, as you said, like that it's not, because the borders of Ohio to everyone else, the ones that we touch, it's not a hard border. It's people can come and go. And So
there's no immigration coming over the Ohio River.
No, there's not. And so I don't think, I think this is going to be pretty tough, meaning the physical distancing, which is, I can't say that this, until there is some type of vaccination. I really think it's as simple as people just have to like stay at home, and you just don't go out and do things like you used to. I also am not smart enough to figure out how we can make sure people go back to work if we can't reopen, that we all hope happens as soon as possible. So this isn't a very good answer, but I think it's, I think this is kind of the normal, and we're going to see those upticks, and you see it in places like Singapore and others that thought they had it kind of figured out pretty early on, but now they're, again, as I mentioned earlier, I've been talking to friends that live in places like that, and they were kind of ahead of the game, and they, for the most part, were pretty successful early on, and now they have shelter at home orders, and they're required to go out. One thing that I wish that we collectively as Americans would do is, I think, as simple as it is, I think you should have to wear a mask every time you go outside, which I wish that would be, kind of forced upon us in one regard, even though I'm very much a personal freedom guy. But I think it's one thing that people can actually do, because right now, the only thing we can do is sit in our butts at home and not spread the virus. But it's just such a simple thing that I think, even if it's not the highest medical grade quality mask out there, if it reduces transmission possibilities from you to someone else by 20%, that seems like enough. Right. And that's such a simple thing that everyone can do to unite behind, and just wear a mask. And it's weird for me. I've done it, gone out of the grocery store, and I feel goofy, but like, you just got to get over it.
I don't think it's as hard as most people think. I mean, and this is where kind of that global perspective comes in. And one of the things that, I really, really respect about the Japanese culture is, when I first went to Japan, I mean, this is, late 90s, early 2000s timeframe. I'm a younger guy, I'm overseas, I'm seeing all sorts of weird stuff. And, I'm on the subway, and I'm seeing these people in masks. And as an American, I'm thinking, oh, well, they must be, germaphobes, and they don't want to get sick. Right. No, they're sick, and they don't want to transmit it to other people.
Right.
And so I think that from a philosophy, that from a cultural perspective, that's just embedded. It's ingrained in their culture. Now, obviously not everyone does it, and there's always going to be those people, with the air quotes. But by and large, that's the culture. And I think that's a good thing, that we adopt those sorts of behaviors. And, like you said, even if it doesn't completely, eliminate the passage of it, but if it diminishes it 10, 20, 30%, hey, that's something, right?
For wearing a mask, which is like such a simple thing to do, doesn't cost a lot of money. And I think that the Japanese example is perfect, because we can't get tested. I knock on wood, have not through any of this had any symptoms that suggest I have it. That doesn't mean I'm not a carrier, or that I don't, it's not hanging out in my body and it's about to hit me tomorrow, but I've had it for 7 days. And so I think that's almost like, I view it as like a personal, again, I'm not a scientist. I'm not an ER doctor, but if I can do something as simple as wear a mask, maybe to help people and keep others, safe from whatever I might be carrying, or just my spit or whatever I just touched, I don't know. To me, it just seems like something that, like, if I can't do anything else, and if I can just wear a mask that helps even a little bit, stay at home that helps a little bit, I think that's just something that I wish we would kind of, again, people have responded by staying home. And I think like that next step is, as I go to the grocery store, I wish you had to wear it going in, because I have a lot of healthcare professionals in my family and friends, and, they're on the front lines. I'm not, and I can't do anything other than to do my little part to help keep them safe and healthy. And if that means something as simple as a mask, great.
No, I think you're right. And, whether you are religious or not, I think it's the notion of, we all need to respect each other. And, we may not philosophically agree that, why should I wear a mask? I'm not sick. I shouldn't do this. It's not about that. It's about doing what's best for our society, being respectful that, hey, you could. And, whether or not you believe whatever you believe, it doesn't matter. It's let's make sure that, we do the best thing for our society, for each other. And, hopefully we get more of that and less of kind of the divisiveness that perhaps we've seen in the past. So as we've been talking, we've actually kind of dived into this next topic that I wanted to quickly go through, which is the new normal. Obviously, like you said, I don't think that it's like a war, and even with a war, you never come back the same. There's this little thing called TD, that you get, and whether it's World War II or Vietnam or Iraq or what have you, there has been major cultural shifts and changes, politically, pop culture, all down the line. But I think even more drastically with this, it's just the way of life, because everyone's at war. It's not just a 5% of the population. And so what do you think that new normal looks like?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, I'm hopeful in that I hope there are things that come out of this that make us better and make, collectively where we live, America in this case, a better place. And I hope it is, from a tech perspective, I hope that it's a kind of a resurgence and a, a doubling down of how do we make things here, and not to, go all globalist versus isolation, but just in the matter, in a safety thing. And, we already make things and produce them here. And so how can we, intelligently, where it puts Ohioans to work, where it puts Americans to work, but does it in a way that helps consumers too, and better quality products, maybe. And so I hope that is partially the new normal. I do hope that, we and I think sometimes as Americans, we don't like to invest in things that might happen. I kind of like to use the example of, thank goodness it's not up to us to build the world's monuments or historical relevant figures, because we would never do it. We would never invest in, coliseums or amazing, we love to travel the world and travel America looking at, big things. And was it Mark Andreessen? He had we got that article the other day about we have to build things. And I agree. Those are the things that, historically people and communities are proud of. And I hope we take pride in where we live in the country. And again, as Americans, I feel like, we won this genetic lottery of just being born here in the years that we were. And so I hope it's a doubling down of things that matter. And I like Instagram like anyone else, but how do we invest in things, collectively? And again, I'd probably come across as a communist at the moment, but I'm not. I believe in personal freedom, and I'm pretty, but I do think of making sure that we invest in the future, because it's something I've been interested in learning kind of in the Asian response to Corona, is that they learned so many lessons from when SARS and some of these other things hit, that they were more prepared than we were. So I guess that's my thing, is that we don't, in this Twitter culture, especially in politics, which I've spent a lot of my career in, the joke used to be that it was a 24-hour news cycle, and then that's how people got off track and forgot what the real intentions were. Now it's a minute to minute, and there can be 17 different things, and you look back on it and you're like, oh, that happened at 9 a.m. today. That seemed like 3 years ago. And I've seen it from the inside of government, where it can literally take years to accomplish things just because of the system, and that's fine. But I hope we kind of move away from this minute to minute we get so caught up in all these little things that we lose sight of like bigger picture. How do we invest collectively into like building a society that, builds things and we create things and we can do it here and just empower the smart people that know how to do it. Cause again, I'm not one of those, but I think, hopefully it's a return to, kind of building stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think you're a commie. I think maybe a fascist dictator. But in all seriousness, I think there's a lot of points that well, all the points I agree with, and as I listen to you talk, some things that I think about as well is those, and also what we talked about earlier is what America is really good at and has always been good at. We haven't always been good at being proactive. And some of our major wins as far as our accomplishments go are because we were the underdog. You take, World War II as an example. We didn't have a great military at that time. I mean, we went from zero to hero in, virtually no time at all. We didn't have, the weapons, or the research, the atomic bomb, none of that stuff. We were a complete underdog. We didn't invent the highway system, but we perfected it. We got it implemented, all that great stuff. So I think, how that applies to today, because I think there's a lot we can learn from history, because I'm a history buff too, is there's a lot of things that this virus has exposed. All the inefficiencies, all the challenges within the system. And what's great about these crises, as bad as that may sound, is it does expose things that need to be fixed. And it's, previously they could be ignored, right? It's no different like what we have seen in politics, and now with the emergence of, hey, should we rethink this thing called the Electoral College? Hey, should we rethink a popular vote? Hey, should we rethink this? How, I don't know what the answer is, but what's great is in a moment of crisis, we're like, hey, we've been ignoring this for 200 years or 50 years or whatever it may be. Let's address this. And hopefully we use this as an opportunity to fix some of these things. One of my biggest gripes, and, I'll temporarily get on my soapbox, is if I can do my taxes on my phone, if I can wire large sum of money from my phone to somewhere else, I should be able to vote from my phone. It should be ubiquitous. And I think that is something that we have to do as a country, so that we do back to that unification of people and our beliefs and community and all that. If there's a few things that I would love to see that would be on my wish list, I mean, that's one, to completely democratize, voting, and, get rid of the shenanigans and all the doubt and disbelief, make it ubiquitous. Make it as easy as, what you see in third world countries, a text. Mm-hmm. Who do you want to vote for? Bob, Sally, Tim, or Joe Bob, 1, 2, 3, 4. Boom. Done. Right. That phone number is tied to that person. Yes, you could make it fraudulent, but you're not going to be able to do it on a wide scale. Right. So I think that new normal, so I'm officially off the soapbox now. That new normal, I think we're going to, one, start to look at some of these problems that have been exposed. I think two, I think people are going to go, I don't want to go back to the office. I think there's going to be some roles where they're like, I don't really need to come in. Maybe I only come in once a week. And
if you're a business, and do you really need all that space? Because you're like, well, I can rotate and have people come in 2 days a week each, and I've just cut my real estate rent expenses down by 50% or something like that. Which, I think some businesses, you look at them and it's like, how are they already in so much trouble? Like 2 weeks into this,
Right.
And it's kind of like, well, how are they, that doesn't seem right. That some of these places, and I'm not talking about like restaurants, because I know that margins and you just have to have that physical presence, but a lot of places it's like, and then we've seen all this stuff with like, you have like Harvard University and some of these other places that are getting millions of dollars of taxpayer money. It's like, well, you have like an $80 billion endowment fund. Like, what? Why do you need taxpayer dollars? Like, this doesn't make any sense to me. Like, let's rethink this. Like, do you really need the money? Or you have like a Ruth Chris, like getting in trouble or, PR trouble for $20 million. And I agree. I think there's kind of goes back to like, and I've seen a lot of people that don't apply for these loans because they don't feel like they actually need them. So how to, and hopefully it's that kind of mindset that, yeah, I'm eligible, but I actually don't need it. So I'm going to save it for the restaurateur or the gym owner or someone like that physically cannot operate. And they have, and how do they keep their lights on when they can open up in a month or two? And so that's one of the things that I hope comes out of it.
Yeah, I agree. And, I think the downstream, the second, third, fourth level effects are going to be really interesting for us because, if you're not going into the office and you're not using up that office space, what happens to the real estate industry? Right. What do our cities start to look like when people aren't driving and, parking lots start to go away? So you see that effect, but also is that going to be a positive driver for something like autonomous vehicles? So now, since we don't have as much traffic and we don't have as big of a risk footprint, now maybe autonomous vehicles are more realistic, as an example, or the timeline gets accelerated. Because again, it's one of those things. It's, it's not right. If, it's when, right?
Right.
And so that's what's going to be fascinating by all this is, I think, from a worker perspective, the whole remote work thing is going to get a whole lot of emphasis. And then from a business perspective, the whole road to digital transformation, the whole remote worker thing is going to be a catalyst for many of these programs that have stalled or have been drawn out, that, it's going to accelerate these digital transformation initiatives for these companies. At least that's what I think.
Yeah. And hopefully, yeah. And I hope that there's almost that after, people get back into a normal or kind of start to settle amidst this new normal that we have. But, why do businesses that are still operational, like why should working from home versus the office stop decisions from being made? And I know there's a lot of bigger picture things and, of supply chains and customers and that type of stuff. But for so many of us that, I can take my laptop and I can work from anywhere in the world, which not every business is like that. Not every worker is like that. But, hopefully there's a kind of an understanding of you don't have to be sitting together. And I think a lot of businesses, some are already built remotely. And I know plenty of companies, tech companies, that only have distributed teams. And so it's business as usual. But for these businesses that are almost paralyzed by having to work from home, that needs to change. And hopefully those leaders can figure it out and with time and they can adapt to it, because the economy shouldn't shut down because I'm logging in my computer from my dining room table and not my high-rise tower downtown anymore.
Right.
And so hopefully, I don't know, I would like to see something like, people figure that out a little bit better.
Yeah, I mean, the last point I'll make on that is I think that people will start to realize a very similar revelation that I had by being a remote worker for the past decade, is that if you look at your automobile, and here in the United States, we've got a big auto culture, right? Auto ownership is a big deal. Whereas in other countries, it's less of a deal. But here, even though we are so pro automobile, you only utilize your vehicle 2 to 4% of the time. So if you look at this from a financial perspective, you're spending $20, $30, $40, $50, $60,000 on this asset, and you're only utilizing it 2 to 4% of the time. That is not a great investment.
Right.
Same is true with your home. you spend, if you're buying a house, depending on where you live, 100, 200, 300. If you're living in, Seattle, a mil, 2 mil on a house, and what's the utilization there? And so what this has kind of taught me, being a remote worker, is I'm utilizing my investment. It's not only my home, but it's also my office. And I think more and more people will think in those terms, because just like with me being a remote worker, that kind of was brought to the forefront, because I'm like, well, why am I buying a vehicle? I'm not going anywhere. I'm just going to the airport to go fly to London or wherever I'm going that week. And so I think it's going to bring those things to the surface. But when we initially talked, I said, typically these things, they last, 30, 45 minutes. We've been talking for about an hour and a half. So it's been a phenomenal conversation.
Yeah.
And I think that people are going to get a lot out of it. A lot of entertainment value probably, and poking fun at me and my soapbox issues, and maybe home issues. But also I think there's a lot of really meaty things to think about. So as we start to wind down, from an Ohio X perspective, what are some of the kind of the parting things that you would like to leave people with? What are some of the key salient things, either from a perspective of why should you get involved, or why should you sponsor as a company? What are some of those key takeaways did you want people to walk away with?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, we hope that Ohio X can increase opportunities for people, for employees, for individuals, for businesses that get involved, because we truly believe that through by better connecting folks across the state of Ohio, opportunities will come out of it. So we're a technology and innovation partnership on our on the website and the tagline. But really, I hope it's a solutions and it's an opportunity organization where people with solutions, looking for solutions, can come to the table. People with ideas, looking for ideas, can come to the table. And opportunity comes out of that, whether that's someone looking for their next gig in tech, or to join an organization, or a joint partnership between a startup and a big corporation, or a agriculture based company that doesn't really, they're not very tech heavy, can find out people that understand technology and can help them leverage it to their advantage. So I hope it's an organization where good people from all diverse sectors, backgrounds, can come together. And through that, we really hope that the connectivity and the sharing of ideas will make Ohio more competitive and more attractive to business, to opportunity, to capital, to whatever.
Awesome. Yeah, I think there's an enormous amount of value for all the obvious reasons, and what we see as great examples all around the states. I would encourage everyone to definitely get involved. And so with that said, so how do they get involved? If they want to get in contact with you specifically to learn more, or to register for a newsletter or any other communication, how can they get involved?
Yeah, just go to ohiox.org. So www.ohiox.org. There you'll be able to see all sorts of information that we have. If you're interested in joining, you can fill out a quick form. If you just want to get our newsletters, which we send out a couple times a week, that have tech innovation news, job openings, events that are happening across the state. It's so easy to sign up. If people want to connect with me, it's just chris@ohiox.org. I'm on LinkedIn, Chris Berry. Twitter is @ChrisBerryOH, short for Ohio, so @ChrisBerryOH. But yeah, happy to talk with anyone. But ohiox.org is a great place to start.
Awesome. Well, listen, again, thank you so much for coming on. I know we kind of went a bit over, but it's been I've enjoyed it. Hopefully you've enjoyed it.
This has been great.
But thanks again for coming. Hopefully we'll do this again soon.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. I appreciate it.
All right. And we are a wrap.